Hey, everybody. Thanks for
Yo,
joining
yo.
us for a Threat Thursday Live. So we are gonna change it up on you a little bit today. I know the live stream and YouTubes and everywhere else is saying we're talking mini plasma right now, but there's been enough stuff going on in the news pertaining to the Middle East and Iran specifically. We thought we would change it up. We've made a newer test recently that kind of covers some of the Void Manticore or Handala group's behaviors, so we figured we'd show that off to you today. But as a quick kind of touch point, real quick, what kind of spurred this on was the joint advisory put out by CISA and the FBI and a few others, kind of talking about how these Iran-affiliated cyber actor groups are starting to target critical infrastructure here in the U.S. again. They've kind of ramped up what they're doing through this last month, last few days or so specifically, where they're targeting PLCs, they're targeting a lot of infrastructure pertaining to, water, electrical power generation, things like that, and not just like private facilities, but also looking at government held and ran facilities and all of those different little sectors and verticals. So with that in mind, if you haven't read this yet, I would go check out this article that CISA has out there, kind of talking about what they've got going on. They've got a really good kind of library of advisories and IOCs and behaviors and things like that surrounding the different Iran-affiliated cyber actors. So I would give this a read. But since this just came out here recently, we decided to kind of switch it up a bit, and we're going to talk Void Manticore with you guys. So these guys are tied to the Iran Ministry of Intelligence and State Security, and they do some pretty interesting things. The reason we wanted to bring this test up and why we made this one is there was a few really cool behaviors that stood out. First one being kind of the way that they use NSIS installers for some of their implants and backdoors, their use of auto IT3 scripts, and just some of the different ways that they're like proxying commands, trying to kind of hide themselves in logs, stuff like that. So this test that we have built up here, this is going to dive in, and it's a rather lengthy test. We're not going to show you all of it and talk through all of it. We're going to kind of hit some of the key points here. But the first piece is kind of plain and simple discovery, right? They're doing a lot of the same stuff everybody else is. You'll see them pumping some quick, like, who am I's, host names, task list, sysinfo, all that kind of stuff, dumping it into a text file, checking if they have egress, if they're sitting in a sandbox, things like that, through just a simple invoke REST method like we see here, which has been seen in recent reporting, and then kicking off some keylogger things. One of the ones that I thought was really cool was diving into their use of the NSIS installers. Now these, they use it and try to do a bit of obfuscation by naming this installer once they drop it as something like CrowdStrike.exe, some kind of other security tool name, just to kind of make it kind of blend in a bit, or at least not stick out as much as something called like Handala underscore installer, which is what we were using in the test just as kind of like a key flag for you guys. But the way this one kind of kicks off, we run it a couple different ways for you to see it. The first one is just a quick run of that executable. It's a mostly benign executable. It's going to do a couple things like do some more checks. It'll spawn another command prompt that basically just echoes out a value and does a few other things. But the key here was kind of to help with detections around the use of NSIS binaries and a couple of the other flags and keys that you can find when they're executed. The other cool route for execution here is how they're doing a little like copy and execute trick where they're dropping the implant on disk, maybe with no file extension, nothing like that. It just appears as a text file or something. And some of the reporting, we saw one named Carol. So we kind of mimicked that a bit. We drop Carol, then it's copied and renamed carol.command and then executed as carol.command. So like as just Carol, it's rather benign, doesn't do much, but then as command prompt, it actually has some different behaviors that it executes. So all in all, I thought that was kind of like a pretty cool way of obfuscating, but still getting execution. They're going to do a few more kind of sandbox checks, looking for security tooling after all of this happens. And then I run this behavior one more time through that /spawn command for Handala installer. And that was to kind of key on this argument list, which is kind of more specific to NSIS binaries. So that's where that kind of built out. As we get into some of the others, the auto IT3 scripts, these are pretty cool. This one is again, just rather benign. It's got a little bit of obfuscation within it. But the point is they've been seen using these a lot. So we wanted to execute it by itself first through that auto IT3 execute script parameter, and then run it again, adding the regjsm on top of it. And what these are doing is recreating some of the different parent-child process chains that we were seeing coming from them, leading up to like an actual like real Handala wiper activity. So we built it in that way. And again, these aren't actually doing anything crazy. They're mostly just generating telemetry to validate that your detections and things like that are working with these different types of compiled binaries. They do a little bit of masquerading. We built in another piece here because they have been seen to use unsigned binaries and pull them onto disk and do other things. So we just made a real quick one called dropper.exe that's going to run from an atypical path, like something like temp, program data, places like that. These have been seen happening. So we built it into the test as well. After that, it's a lot of kind of the norms, right? They're diving into doing like credential access, trying to use minidump, get LSAS, registry hive saves, bringing it back offline for later. They're writing all of that data to a single space in this test, just so it's an easy find and flag. We called it decoy data. But all of this stuff is kind of getting dumped in there and exfilled. And then as they're going to do kind of their wiper piece, we generate some files and things like that. And then we turn around and basically do a bit shift on it to mess up all of the data that's in that space. The two other kind of unique highlights in here outside of just the normal wiper behavior is command and control. There was two pretty cool ones we saw them using before, and one of them was kind of like the NetBird installer. So we're bringing this in as kind of like, another VPN process or tool, however you want to call it, tunneling tool. And we execute that and kick it off inside of the platform. It's not calling back to anything. It's not actively doing anything. And then it's going to check its status and then turn itself off and tear down. We do the same thing with Mosquito Pod. So this is kind of like an MQTT other C2 route that they've been seen using in past reporting. So we mimic that by having it hop onto localhost. It opens the standard port that's been seen in reporting and hangs out for a minute, and then we tear it all back down. So you're getting that telemetry, you're getting to see those different tools being brought in place and being able to start trying to key off on those kinds of things. But outside of that, everything else is pretty much kind of the norm. They do a little bit of trying to stop security tooling if they've got enough elevation. Their wiper stuff, like I said, we're doing kind of a bit shift against the files. They're trying to delete shadow copies. The one kind of interesting fact that's been seen in here is this, the WScript shell piece pop-up that's happening. They've been known to do that, to just kind of throw a pop-up in your face to kind of disalarm the end user and make them kind of feel like, okay, it's CrowdStrike, they're doing whatever they're supposed to do or whatever the security tool happens to be for that environment. And meanwhile, everything's kind of getting erased. So all in all, it's a pretty interesting test. It's a very lengthy test, but this has a lot of good different artifacts and behaviors that you can key off on for detections. And with that, I will leave it to the detection guru himself to talk about it.
I didn't realize we had another guest on.
Oh, really? You just stopped doing your thing there? I mean, I did tell you I was going to make you more red than blue. Are you finally admitting that?
Now I got to throw all my red t-shirts away. Yeah, so we did the detections a little bit differently for today's. This is a little more of kind of telling the story of what's happening and then having everything tied or tagged with to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So just kind of a different view of how we normally see it. But up top, still keeping it with those behavioral detections, right? I feel like we talk about this probably every Threat Thursday, about like monitoring for like your event logs being cleared, registry hives being touched, different kind of things like that that are abnormal, but that can provide you just like a literal static or just like a literal dynamic count of what is happening, right? So even having something as simple as like monitoring for event code 13, which is registry modification in Sysmon, or monitoring for drawing a blank on what the event code is for the Windows event logs being cleared, but having those event codes in there and just doing a stats count on a list of those and just monitoring it every day to see if it goes up or down will help tip you off to if that is happening in your environment, right? So here we see from this, we had 4 registry hives or keys that were touched or modified, and then 2 Windows event logs that were cleared. The registry hives, probably not a super great detection because that's going to happen a lot, but your event logs being cleared is probably something that you want to incorporate inside of your environment. You could have that query across your entire enterprise and just check the number every day, right? Going on to it, a little bit of this will be kind of what Trey had already talked about, because I'm essentially showing what he did, but from our side over here in Splunk. So at first we see some discovery commands and some recon happening, right? Some pretty typical sysinfo hostname. See them writing out to a file here. From pulling out the parent image, we see that this TT Live Handala is in there, so something to tee off on for some additional queries and searches and things like that. We see that they're looking for some find strings for some different processes, Sophos, Avast, things like that, looking at different antiviruses and pieces like that. See over on the right that internet connection discovery, trying to reach out to ICANN has IP. Like Trey said, a very typical site that attackers will utilize. IT admins use it a lot too. I use it quite a bit. But to reach out and see, do we have connection to the internet? If so, what is our public IP address, right? So in there, just that wget or invoke web request, essentially wget to reach out to that site. And then later on, looking at what files are dropped to disk, right? So this is looking at actual file events on disk. So event code 11 in sysmon, and we could see have that netbird active profile, that auto IT3 that Trey was talking about, Carol CMD, lots of interesting stuff here. Another thing to point out, right? All of this is in public or in temp, program data, atypical directories, right? Again, you want to monitor inside those atypical directories. That's all we're doing here, is looking at target file names that exist outside of like system32 program files x86 within the time period that we executed this test. And then on there, later on, execution. This really came from, I knew what Trey was running, so I just have the images look for those different processes that were spawned in there. But just by querying the images, or even just having the parent image be TT Live underscore Handala, which we had identified, further up here in the discovery commands, even just looking at that and pulling out what was spawned by it, or what is the grandchild process of that, would pull out all of this info. So auto IT3 with that regasm, command prompt running make NSIS, running CrowdStrike, that Handala installer, then running the CrowdStrike.exe outside of public, right? Lots of different pieces here that we could kind of tip off on. Masquerading in defense evasion, not really too much to see here. Just copying Carol over to carol.cmd. Same thing with the dropper. One piece that's pretty interesting here is because that W script that Trey was talking about, that's going to have that pop up, is logged as a PowerShell command. That's just 4104, 4103 are for your PowerShell script block text messages. So in here you can see literally that same thing that Trey. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to click on that. I meant to just highlight it. 1 second for it to load. So what Trey was talking about there, that W script shell pops up, and that is, CrowdStrike telling you everything is fine, this is totally normal, pieces like that. So because it, that W script shell has to execute, we have the log of that, which again is pretty indicative of some kind of malicious activity going on, because that's pretty atypical that something that has no image would then spawn this, right? And then credential access, these are just command line arguments that we're teeing off of here. So looking for LSAS in the command line argument, looking for mini dump, and then saving out of the SAM system and security hives. So I feel like we talk about that probably in most of the tests that we do. It's incredible that really almost every threat actor does this, right? It seems kind of silly, and it even is pretty easy to detect, but we see threat actors do it pretty much in every bit of CTI that we read, right? That's why we have it on almost every test. Another kind of better LSAS detection that we have, I had written on here, I don't know why I didn't include it in the dashboard, but in here we can see that the run DLL is trying to access LSAS here and utilize the comservices.dll to do that. So this is really a better, more behavioral based detection than that keyword detection I was showing a second ago. So in here, we see that they're targeting LSAS coming from run DLL32 using this comm service trace. And we see that this one with all the F's on the end means that it was in fact granted access to this. So this is pretty atypical and not great, right? If you have something that is able to access LSAS with full permissions, like we see over here, you're probably looking at your credentials being dumped through LSAS, right? So a much better detection to run it this way than to do it with this command line arguments over here. Because you could do obfuscation or run it in memory or anything like that, and it would totally miss this. But because if you're looking at the actual call traces itself and that process being accessed, they're not going to be able to get around this, right? This has to exist for them to be able to pull that LSAS memory and dump your creds. And then onto collection. So again, looking at those registry hives that we dumped, as well as here, this is a really interesting one. So with SCYTHE, we have a keylogger module, and then for this, the Void Manicore Handala actually wrote their own kind of keylogger utilizing some DLLs. So what we're looking for here is this get async key state. So what that's doing is monitoring. I just clicked on it again. What that's doing is monitoring your click state, as it were. So every time the keyboard is pressed and released, that essentially is a new thing, right? So that's a new key state. So it's monitoring for that key state. So every time it changes, that's what it's recording. So that's a pretty interesting one that we haven't used before. Typically, we'll just use the keylogger module that we have built into SCYTHE, but you can actually do essentially the same thing inside of PowerShell by calling some DLLs and this get async key state. And then some that C2 command and control. Here, we're just looking at those command line arguments. I'm not looking at any kind of network telemetry or anything like that. So just running this netbird and the mosquito pub.exe. Impact, we see kind of twofold here, or I guess triple, because we see another piece down there of doing that shadow copy deletion. We see that a few different ways, both from like security event logs, which is this 104 saying that the system and application log has been cleared, as well as event code 1, which is process creation, which is the actual command line arguments itself. So showing it kind of two different ways. As far as like a behavioral higher fidelity detection, that 104 security and system log being cleared is going to be a bit better because once the log is cleared, it has to write that, right? So again, probably a better way to do it than just relying on that command line process creation event codes instead. And then here we see some services that are attempting to be stopped. This service isn't a real field. It's just a regex to pull the last word on there, right? Just looking at command line arguments, that's not any crazy kind of log. And then looking at, again, some destroying data attempts. So this is looking at the Windows script lock log for this bit movement Trey was talking about earlier. I don't think you would really find this on your own, just kind of like digging through the logs. The best way to look for something like this would be to kind of break it down into more specific TTPs, if that makes sense. So what I mean by that is like for this, I'm not thinking of this as trying to just destroy this data. What I'm looking at here is this like bit movement that we see over here. So essentially you would look in your CTI, see that that's what they're doing, and then I would hunt or base your detection based off of that specific TTP. So if you're just looking for like something's been destroyed, I need to go find it, and you're just scrolling through the logs, you're probably not going to find this, right? So I think of this one, if you had to pick something to try to like trigger off of this, it would be like this bit movement that they have over there. And then it's just some typical cleanups that we have. And then I'm not going to go over the kind of ground truth here, but this is the entire threat hunt, essentially, from everything that we were able to observe this Handala test doing. So it's really everything that we had talked about before, but in a chronological order, more of a threat hunting kind of phase going through it. So with that, yeah, I know that one was a lot bit different than the ones that we typically have, but thought it'd be neat to switch it up a little bit and give you guys a different view of what we're looking at here.
Yeah, these are definitely different, but this is an interesting one, especially if you're already a Scythe customer. The new detections that we created for this, we actually dug for a bit to try and find if some already existed, like specifically surrounding the NSIS installer artifacts or the auto IT3 script execution. And we didn't really find any good ones. So if you don't have any and you're a Scythe customer, check out the knowledge base article for this test, and you'll be able to pull them down and kind of hit the ground running with those. Again, I know this was a bit of a pivot from MiniPlasma today, but we kind of felt this was more important to talk about and all in all, an interesting test. So thanks for hanging out with us and chatting today. We will catch y'all on the next one.
Thanks, everybody.
See you.